Money buys comfort, access, and protection, but it doesn't cancel physics, luck, or bad decisions. These are the worst deaths of rich people, where wealth created the illusion of safety, and the consequences were just as final as anyone else's. It was December 14th, 2013, in North Scottsdale, Arizona. Before sunrise, a gated estate-sealed garage glowed with lights as engines idled, quietly allowing dangerous gas levels to build. Graham Klein was 52, a self-made luxury car reseller whose income depended on maintaining high-value inventory in near-perfect condition. Many of the vehicles he handled were worth 6 and 7 figures, with insurance riders tied to mechanical status and documented upkeep. He believed regular engine cycling preserved seals, batteries, and electronics, and he avoided outside mechanics to limit exposure and liability. Control over the cars remained central to how he managed risk. The garage functioned as a private showroom rather than a typical residential space. It was fully insulated, climate-controlled, and equipped with humidity regulation, and a dedicated exhaust extraction system installed years earlier. The system had operated without visible failure, leading to deferred inspections. Warning labels and indicator lights remained in place, reinforcing the assumption that the safeguards were still functioning as designed. That evening was his scheduled engine day. A friend stopped by briefly, then left before the doors were closed. Graham shut the main bay to keep dust out and started 3 cars in sequence, one idling while he moved to the next. A breaker had tripped earlier. The exhaust fan light was on. Carbon monoxide began building immediately, colorless and odorless, displacing oxygen in the blood and preventing cells from using what remained. Graham walked between cars, checking gauges and blipping throttles. A headache formed, then lightheadedness. He read it as heat and fatigue, not poisoning. He sat on a stool between 2 idling vehicles and texted a photo of the collection warming. Minutes passed. He stood, swayed, and fell forward, striking the concrete. The engines kept running. Exhaust pooled low where his body lay, and oxygen delivery to his brain collapsed. Security cameras showed no struggle. A neighbor's overnight motion alert recorded the lights steady, engines audible. No alarm sounded. The carbon monoxide detectors had been silenced after nuisance trips. Household staff arrived after dawn, opened the door, and staggered back as the air burned their throats. Emergency services were called. Fire crews ventilated the garage and shut down the vehicles. Paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene. Gas measurements remained hazardous. Dispatch records show the call at 6:18 a.m., with first units arriving 9 minutes later. Entry required ventilation. Investigators used engine temperatures, fuel levels, and cameras to reconstruct timing. Friends described a reliance on routine. Medical findings confirmed carbon monoxide exposure causes confusion before collapse, matching the scene evidence. The medical examiner ruled the death carbon monoxide poisoning, with blood tests showing lethal carboxyhemoglobin levels and no signs of struggle. Investigators found the exhaust fan breaker tripped and carbon monoxide alarms disabled after prior false alerts. The garage was secured as a hazardous scene, and the vehicles were removed. During review, the car collection was placed under lien, delaying sales and increasing storage costs until the case was closed. It was June 7, 2015, on a private game reserve in South Africa's Limpopo province. The morning was cool and quiet, dry brush and leaf litter from the winter season. The operation was presented as controlled, but the animals there were known to turn violently when pressured, wounded, or pushed too close. Derek Vaughn was 46, a US-based executive in industrial logistics, whose income placed him firmly among the ultra-wealthy. He owned multiple properties, traveled exclusively through private arrangements, and moved within elite business circles where success was measured publicly. The safari was not about conservation or patience, but about securing a photograph that would signal status among peers who treated rare experiences as proof of rank. He booked an exclusive, high-cost private hunting package that removed him from standard group schedules and placed the hunt entirely on his timetable. While the reserve maintained strict safety protocols, private clients were allowed greater flexibility. Derek acknowledged these limits but pressed for closer positioning and control, carrying a high-caliber rifle despite limited experience under live fire stress. That afternoon, the group tracked a mature Cape buffalo through dense brush near uneven ground. Conditions were poor for a close approach. The professional hunter advised holding position until the buffalo moved into a clearer line of sight. Derek pressed to advance, citing the private slot he had paid for and the limited window remaining. The delay protocols were relaxed under client pressure rather than safety necessity. He insisted the shot be taken closer for a more dramatic image. As they moved forward, footing worsened. Roots cut across the path, and visibility narrowed. Derek moved ahead of the trackers, stepping beyond the spacing normally enforced during standard hunts, a concession made because the hunt was classified as a private, client-directed outing. He raised the rifle and fired. The shot struck but failed to stop the animal. Instead, it triggered an immediate response. The animal turned and charged, closing distance faster than expected. Derek attempted to step backward while keeping the rifle trained forward. His heel caught on a hidden root. He fell hard onto his back, the rifle barrel pitching upward. The animal struck his torso with full force, knocking the wind from his lungs. The ground shook as it drove into him again. A horn penetrated his lower abdomen, tearing through muscle and blood vessels. Another strike hit his upper chest, puncturing a lung. Blood soaked into the uneven ground beneath him, darkening the soil around his torso. His breathing became wet and irregular, each attempt weaker than the last. The professional hunter fired multiple rounds to stop the charge. Trackers rushed in once the animal fell back. One applied pressure to visible wounds, while another called for emergency evacuation on the radio. The reserve's response team was dispatched immediately, but the injuries were beyond survival. Derek lost consciousness within minutes. He showed no purposeful movement by the time help arrived approximately 12 minutes later. Body-worn cameras and GPS logs documented the entire sequence, including the advance beyond advised distance and the failed first shot. The medical examiner later ruled the cause of death as massive blood loss and internal organ destruction from goring. The lungs were punctured, major vessels in the pelvis were torn, and abdominal organs were ruptured. Death occurred rapidly due to hemorrhage and respiratory failure. The reserve completed a full incident report and submitted all footage to authorities. Derek's travel companions requested discretion, but the reserve declined. Within days, his company removed him from promotional materials, and the private safari footage became part of an official incident file, replacing the image he sought with a record of preventable failure. It was November 19, 2018, in the Santa Ynez Valley of California, near a private estate carved into the hills above the vineyards. Low clouds were already pressing down on the ridgelines as dusk approached, softening distances and flattening depth, the kind of weather that rarely stops plans, but quietly changes outcomes. Colin Wexler was 44, a hedge fund partner whose success came from speed and certainty. He had built a reputation for closing deals quickly and eliminating friction, both in business and in life. Friends described him as generous but impatient, intolerant of waiting when money could shorten the gap. Convenience to him was a tool wealth existed to buy. Colin used charter helicopters the way others used cars. He maintained a private landing area near his estate and worked with a regional charter service that flew executives along the coast and valleys. Aviation weather briefings were usually treated as formalities. Familiar routes bred confidence, and confidence dulled caution, especially when flights were short. That evening, Colin planned a quick run to a winery dinner to retrieve guests and several rare bottles he wanted served before dessert. Weather reports showed lowering ceilings, increasing winds, and patchy fog forming along the hills. The pilot advised delaying until conditions stabilized. Colin dismissed the delay recommendation and increased compensation to encourage departure despite deteriorating weather. The helicopter departed along a known valley corridor, one the pilot had flown dozens of times. As they climbed, visibility narrowed. Hills that had been clearly defined moments earlier blurred into gray shapes. Wind pushed unevenly against the aircraft, nudging it off its usual track. Approaching the ridgeline near Colin's property, the helicopter entered cloud. The horizon vanished. Without visual reference, the pilot relied on instruments while trying to maintain clearance. Turbulence increased. The pilot initiated a turn to retreat back down the valley, but a gust pushed the aircraft sideways. The rotorcraft clipped a slope or tree line. The initial impact severed the tail boom, instantly removing directional control. The helicopter yawed violently, rotating as lift collapsed. It struck the hillside again and broke apart, scattering debris across the slope. Fuel ignited along the wreckage perimeter, but the force of deceleration had already done its work. Passengers were thrown forward and sideways, bodies compressed against restraints and interior structures. Skull fractures, crushed chests, and torn organs occurred in fractions of a second. A nearby vineyard worker heard the impact and called emergency services at 6:42 p.m. Fire crews and deputies arrived within 14 minutes, navigating narrow access roads in low visibility. By the time they reached the site, there were no survivors to extract, only burning debris. Investigators later reconstructed the flight using GPS data, onboard audio and flight data, and text messages sent minutes before departure. The weather deterioration was documented. The route deviation and attempted turn were evident from the flight path. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as multiple blunt force injuries. Severe head trauma, chest compression, and internal bleeding were consistent with high-energy impact. Fire damage occurred after death and was not required for fatal injury. Flight logs and messages showed clear pressure to proceed despite warnings. The pilot's family later pursued legal action against the estate and charter broker for coercion and accepted risk. Regulators temporarily closed the private landing area while reviewing the operation, leaving the pad unused above the quiet vineyards. It was July 4, 2016, in Greenwich, Connecticut, at a waterfront estate already prepared for celebration. The lawn was immaculate, the water calm, and the fireworks launch area neatly marked off, giving the impression that everything was under control in a setting built for spectacle, not safety. Howard Creel was 58, a real estate magnate whose success came from visibility as much as deals. He built luxury developments along the coast and preferred to host his own celebrations, positioning himself as the center of attention. Business partners described him as generous but demanding, intolerant of being told no, especially in front of an audience. He hired a licensed fireworks vendor accustomed to large municipal shows. Commercial-grade shells were set in mortar tubes and designed to be fired electrically from a safe distance. The system depended on strict exclusion zones, timing protocols, and clear authority given to the pyrotechnic lead, not the client. As the evening progressed, Howard drank steadily and moved between guests, narrating the setup and promising something memorable. He asked for a larger shell than planned and insisted on lighting one himself for a photograph. The crew warned him repeatedly that manual ignition was not part of the plan and violated safety rules. Wind off the water increased slightly, and the vendor delayed the sequence to recheck stability. Howard interpreted the pause as hesitation. He crossed the barricade tape while guests raised phones, treating the perimeter as suggestion rather than boundary. The crew prepared to abort the entire show. Howard approached a loaded mortar tube as technicians moved to power down. He bent forward with a lighter, leaning directly over the tube while arguing about timing. The shell inside was armed for electrical firing and still connected to the control system, which had not yet been fully powered down. At that moment, the shell fired from the mortar during the shutdown sequence, lifting only inches before detonating. The blast wave struck Howard at point-blank range. Pressure slammed into his abdomen and chest, collapsing internal structures. Fragmentation from the tube and shell casing tore through his neck and torso. He was thrown backward onto the grass, landing hard. Blood spread rapidly beneath him, dark and pulsing. Guests screamed and scattered, some falling as they ran. The crew immediately shut down remaining tubes and secured unexploded shells to prevent further detonations. A guest called emergency services within seconds. The first responders arrived in 9 minutes, finding Howard unresponsive with catastrophic injuries. Paramedics attempted hemorrhage control, but the damage was beyond survivability. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later determined the cause of death as blast trauma, with massive bleeding. The pressure wave ruptured organs and shrapnel caused fatal penetrating wounds. Loss of life occurred within moments of detonation. Investigators reviewed multiple phone videos showing Howard crossing the safety line and leaning over the tube. The vendor's contract and safety briefing documented clear refusal and authority limits. The estate settled several lawsuits filed by injured staff and traumatized guests, and the waterfront lawn remained closed through the rest of summer. Regulatory review later cited inadequate client control procedures, prompting changes to permitting and on-site authority requirements. It was September 13, 2014, at a lakefront property in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, where steady rain had soaked the shoreline since dawn. The estate sat quiet behind trees, and the waterline crept higher against stone steps, the kind of slow change that rarely feels urgent until it is. Russell Dane was 61, a wealthy property developer known for insisting on custom solutions. He disliked shared spaces and public exposure, preferring controlled systems he owned outright. His projects emphasized exclusivity, and he promoted private infrastructure as a mark of quality. Friends described him as meticulous, impatient, and confident that engineering could eliminate inconvenience. The tunnel beneath his home reflected that belief. It connected the mansion to a boathouse, sloping gently toward the lake. Steel floodgates and sump pumps were installed to stop backflow during storms, powered by the main supply with a battery backup. The system worked in testing, but it was not designed to municipal standards or extreme surge. That afternoon, rain intensified across the region. Storm drains overflowed and lake levels rose. Power flickered repeatedly as wind pushed water into low areas. Staff advised Russell to stay clear of the tunnel until conditions improved, noting that the backup pumps were limited. He worried about damage and insisted on checking it himself. He entered the tunnel with a flashlight, wearing dress shoes. Water was already ankle-deep and moving toward the house. The air felt cooler and damp, and the sound of flowing water echoed off concrete. He walked forward, watching the gate housing as the rain hammered above. Minutes later, pressure increased from the lakeside. Debris carried by runoff lodged against the floodgate seal. The battery backup strained. The seal failed abruptly, and a surge of water rushed in, filling the tunnel from wall to wall. The slope turned it into a channel. The current knocked Russell off balance. He fell sideways, striking his shoulder and head against the concrete wall. The flashlight skittered ahead, briefly illuminating churning water. He tried to stand, but the flow swept him toward a bend where the ceiling dropped lower. As he was dragged, his head struck the wall repeatedly. Bruises formed along his arms as he reached for seams and conduit. The current pinned his chest to the floor, forcing water into his mouth and nose. His movements slowed as oxygen ran out. A groundskeeper noticed alarms from the pump system and called emergency services. Responders arrived within 12 minutes but could not enter safely until the surge eased. By the time water levels stabilized, Russell was found wedged near the bend, unresponsive. The medical examiner determined the cause of death as drowning with blunt force injuries. Water was present in the lungs, confirming inhalation while alive. Bruising and fractures matched repeated impacts with concrete during the surge. Investigators found debris packed into the gate channel and the backup power depleted. Reports cited insufficient redundancy and lack of professional flood modeling. Russell's company paused custom underground projects, and the tunnel was sealed, documented as a preventable failure. Local authorities required engineering reviews for similar private structures around the lake, focusing on drainage, power, and access. Insurance assessors documented losses and code violations, while contractors removed standing water and debris under supervision. The property remained closed through the season, pending remediation and certification by licensed professionals. Employees submitted written statements describing warnings that went unheeded, and maintenance logs showed deferred upgrades. The final report concluded the tunnel failed under conditions it was not designed to handle, leaving a record of risk assumed for privacy and control rather than safety. Lessons were circulated. It was March 18, 2018, in McLean, Virginia, inside a newly completed private estate. System logs showed the house in test mode that evening. Below ground, a sealed room had been closed intentionally to evaluate full isolation under controlled conditions. Victor Halden was 58, a billionaire defense sector investor who built his career funding hardened infrastructure projects. He advised contractors, donated to policy institutes, and spoke often about resilience and continuity. Privacy and preparedness were his obsessions. He disliked depending on public systems and believed the highest tier of safety was ownership. Over 2 years, Victor financed a personal escape chamber modeled loosely on government continuity facilities. It was not a replica, but it borrowed concepts: blast-rated doors, independent power, filtered air, and a sealed envelope meant to operate without outside input. Contractors warned that such systems were only safe with constant monitoring. Victor overruled them. He wanted a self-contained solution he could demonstrate to potential partners. The chamber sat beneath the house, accessed through a concealed stairwell. It had a manual door wheel, redundant lighting, battery-backed controls, and an oxygen delivery system designed to regulate air levels during full isolation. Unlike public facilities, it lacked staffed oversight. Victor insisted he would test it personally, alone, to validate the concept. That night's test was riskier than planned. A software update had been pushed earlier in the day to the air management system. A technician flagged a calibration warning and advised postponing full seal. Victor declined. Project notes later showed the test was intended to assess error tolerance without intervention. Staff were told to leave once the test began. He entered the chamber with a tablet, closed the inner door, and spun the wheel until the seals engaged. Exterior cameras confirmed the lock. The oxygen system switched to internal supply. Initial readings appeared normal. Victor logged notes, pacing the room, confident the redundancy would hold. Minutes later, the air management system failed to compensate as carbon dioxide levels rose. Sensor misreads interpreted the atmosphere as acceptable, preventing alarms from triggering. Victor felt the change first as warmth, then pressure in his chest. He slowed, sat on the bench, and attempted to access controls. The interface lagged. Medical examiners concluded hypoxia developed rapidly as carbon dioxide accumulated. His breathing became shallow, coordination failed, and he stumbled. Interior cameras showed repeated manual override attempts consistent with cognitive impairment. He collapsed to the floor. The lights dimmed as battery systems compensated. He crawled toward the door, leaving smears on the concrete, then stopped moving. The chamber remained sealed until forced entry, operating as configured. A security supervisor noticed the test running long and attempted to check in. There was no response. Emergency services were called at 9:41 p.m. Fire crews arrived within 11 minutes but could not force entry without specialized equipment. By the time the door was breached, Victor was unresponsive. The medical examiner determined the cause of death as hypoxia caused by a mismanaged sealed air environment. Blood oxygen levels were critically low. There were no signs of trauma beyond minor impact injuries from falls. Loss of consciousness would have occurred quickly once oxygen dropped below survivable thresholds. Investigators found the air management system miscalibrated, with carbon dioxide alarm thresholds disabled to prevent false triggers during testing. The chamber functioned mechanically, but without human oversight. Victor's company suspended all private continuity projects. The room was sealed again, documented, and left unused, a controlled space that failed when control mattered most. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you like this video.